record.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex. I'm the program coordinator here at Fox Haven, and on behalf of the farm, I'd like to thank you all for supporting our work amidst the coronavirus shutdowns. Your donations are extremely kind, and every little bit truly helps. Just a little bit about Fox Haven for the folks who are new. We are a farm and nonprofit ecological learning center in Jefferson, Maryland. That's less than 10 minutes from Frederick, Maryland, and about an hour from Baltimore. Our mission is to help deepen the connection between humankind and the natural world, and we fulfill our mission by growing fresh herbs using organic and regenerative farm practices and hosting educational classes and retreats. In addition, when we are not practicing social distancing, we open our doors for you to come and stay in one of our farmhouse rentals. These locations are perfect for private gatherings, celebrations, and enjoying some much needed peace and quiet. To learn more about Fox Haven, you can always visit our website, which is www.foxhavenfarm.org. And for some of the Baltimore folks, we do have a fresh herb CSA that's starting soon. Our deadline's May 13th. And that includes a monthly bundle of fresh medicinal herbs as well as educational classes to deepen your knowledge and connection to plants. Just a couple of announcements. By registering for this event, you'll be added to our email list, but you can unsubscribe anytime. And we only send out emails about once a week to keep you informed on what's coming up at Fox Haven and some valuable plant knowledge that we hope you'll love. Following tonight's class, you will receive a recording of the presentation and an informational handout by email. And we'll also include a 5-minute feedback survey. So we hope that you can fill that out and let us know how we did today and what other educational offerings you would like to see at Fox Haven. We take your feedback seriously and use it to shape future programs. Thank you again for coming. Now I'll pass it over to Lacey, who will tell us all about nettles.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm gonna share my screen so you can see a little presentation I have built for us. All right, and if you're new to Zoom, you might have to move things out of the way, like move your Zoom boxes out of the way to see things. All right, so all things nettles. So I'd love to start actually by asking you all. You can either unmute yourself or you can send us a comment in the chat section. What is your experience with nettles? Like, how have you experienced nettles before?
I've purchased the dried herbs and I started putting them in my homemade broths after the tea and broth class with you, and I love it. I think it's so tasty and adds great flavor, and I love all of the vitamins that it adds, but that's my experience with it.
Awesome. Alex, can you read the chats for us if people are sharing experiences?
Yep. Liz says that there's a patch near me and I have tea and add to rice, beans, and soup. Kristen, hi Kristen, she says she uses it for moon cycle tea and soup. And Jaya said she heard about it before as an herb, has used it in an herbal bath. She knows that it helps with lactation issues, but has lots of other uses that she'd like to know about. Shelly says, before I heard about them from you, Lacey, in the foraging group, she only thought that they were good to stinger. And Michelle says nettle tea is also a great fertilizer and that she uses it before her comfrey comes in. Laura says that she uses it, or she's had a skin reaction to stinging nettle many times, and then if possible use jewelweed to help the stinging feeling. And Christine says that she's harvested it fresh for cooking, bought tea and also bought a really good Zatar mix with nettle from Little Bird Herbals.
Anyone else want to share?
I made pesto with it last night.
Nice.
Yeah, it was good.
Well, dang, y'all should teach the class. Sounds like you know all the ways to use nettles. It's funny because it depends on who I talk to about nettles, but a lot of people, when I ask them about nettles, they definitely talk about just being stung by nettles, especially maybe as kids when they didn't know better and were running through the forest. It kind of depends on what access they had to nature and those kind of areas. But that's usually the thing that I get the most is kind of like, oh, nettles, they're awful, they're stinging. So I wanted to start there and just talk about that since that's what a lot of people have had some exposure to. Hold on a second. I want to see if I can make my little box smaller. There we go. Okay. Can I move this whole bar? Yeah, great. Get it out of here. Okay, there we go. All right, so we'll start with the sting, right? So if you've experienced this sting before, then you know that the whole plant pretty much is covered in these trichomes or hairs that are full of formic acid and serotonin and histamine and all different kinds of acids actually. And there's a really fine silica tip to it that gets brushed off pretty easily. And once it gets brushed off, those little hypodermic needles then inject that right into your skin. And that's how we get that stinging and buzzing sensation that a lot of folks will get with nettle stings. Here's a slide on the chemistry of stinging nettles. So like I said, there's that histamine and serotonin, acetylcholine. Has anyone heard of serotonin before that can remind the rest of us what serotonin is? No one wants to say. Serotonin, a lot of people know serotonin as like one of the happy hormones, right? We think of it as a neurotransmitter, a lot of which is produced in our gut that gives us that feeling of wellness and happiness and ease. So it's thought of a lot in kind of the mental health world as well as just kind of like our bodily health. But it's interesting that in this form, the serotonin is actually one of the chemicals that is really irritating to the skin when it is directly injected into the skin. There's also those acids there, the formic acid, tartaric acid, and oxalic acid. The person that wrote this, The Chemistry of Stinging Nettle, had done kind of a review of the different folklore of plants that are used for helping to ease the sting and didn't find a whole lot of studies out there, which isn't very surprising to me. And so kind of said, you should probably just use antihistamine creams. But as somebody already mentioned, we have some other options available to us, right? So some plants that you might think of if you've just been stung by nettles is wild violet leaf. So crushing up the leaf or chewing the leaf and sticking it right on to the affected area. A couple years ago in our foraging class, we did an experiment where Caitlin, who was running the class, hit herself all over her arm with the nettles and then chewed up violet leaf and put it on just part of the arm. And after a couple minutes, she took it off and we could see the red welts on her arm where she hadn't put it, and where she had put it looked like normal skin again. So at least, empirically it did work. Chickweed, if you have chickweed available to you in the early spring or the early fall, you might have chickweed. You can also just crush that right up. It's really like moist and has a lot of, kind of like succulent quality to it. Jewelweed, someone mentioned jewelweed, right? You can use the jewelweed even when it's young. Right now it's not flowering like this, but you'll be able to, pull up that plant and use the sap that's in the stem there to put that right onto the sting. Plantain leaf, also one that we think of for all kinds of skin issues. Yellowdock is the one that was on his slide there, and it's also the one that's in Blackberry, Cove, Herbal. And this one, this book that I'll be sharing a couple of things out of has some really great things to say about the folklore of herbs, in particular in Appalachia and the Appalachian culture. And so she says that in country antidote for nettle stings, you should use dock, and that you should rub the fresh dock leaves on the welts and say 3 times, nettle in, dock out. Don't dock rub the nettle out. Or another version of the chant is to slowly chant while rubbing on dock leaves, out nettle, in dock. Dock will have a new dress, nettle will not. And I think these kind of things are so cool. These old or current even, you know, chants and kind of like songs that are associated with things like this, also as a way to kind of just like take your mind off of the pain that you're experiencing, right? Or a way to teach children that the pain is temporary, and that if, you know, if they can kind of focus their mind on something else, that pain will dissipate. And then Yellowdock also has some properties. There was one study that showed that the Yellowdock did have some properties that interfered with the histamine reaction. So it does have some backing. Right?
Hey, Lacey, what is that name of that book?
It's called Blackberry Cove Herbal, and it's Linda Orrs-Rago. She lives right here in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, about 15 minutes from us.
Thank you.
Yeah. So nettle, the word that we know as nettle, comes from the Middle English word N-E-T-E-L, that comes from the root word net, meaning to sew or to spin or to bind or to tie. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of nettle as a fabric and as a cordage. So we use this word as nettle, the word nettle, as a noun to describe the plant, but I think it's also really cool to think about how the interactions between plants and people can find their way into language in other ways. And so we also use this as a verb to mean that you've nettled somebody, right? Or somebody feels nettled. They feel like they've been provoked or disturbed or vexed or irritated. So I think that's an interesting way that it's you know, transferred into our language through those experiences that people have with nettles. Here's some folklore about nettle. In the language of flowers, nettle says, "You are hateful." In medieval flower symbolism, it signifies envy, and in Victorian times, the nettle meant slander. Ruled by Mars, the planet of war, and associated with Scorpio. So it's from the Stinging Nettle Notebook, which you can find online, Robin Harford. A lot of the folklore does come out of European, and especially kind of like Scottish, Celtic tradition. But nettle is found in many places in the world, and there are many plants that are called nettle that are in the nettle family that might not be the Urtica dioica that we have, you know, that we're usually talking about when we're talking about nettle. But there are many plants that are used in the nettle family, and we'll touch on a couple ways that those are used. If you ever read the book The Wild Swans with Hans Christian Andersen, that was one that I read growing up, but I had forgotten that nettles were part of this. So, you know, the evil stepmother turns the brothers into swans, and the young girl has to go then and pick these nettles and make them into clothing to cover the swans, so that they can come back as young men again. So this is a page out of that book. And then there's also the Tibetan story of Malrepa, the green yogi. And he was a yogi that lived in a cave, and in that cave there was a spring, and near that spring there were nettles that were growing, and that was the primary source of food for Malrepa. And so they said that his skin turned green from eating so much of it, and his hair became prickly. And there's stories associated with Malrepa of these hunters that would go out into the wilderness to hunt, and they would find him in his cave, and they would ask for, you know, food and shelter, and all he could offer was nettles. And then he, you know, would explain to them the path to enlightenment that he had found through this very simple life of nettles and meditation. There's also the 9 herbs charm that comes out of an Anglo-Saxon book of medical treatments and charms. This one was for treating poisonings and infections. And you'll see that down there towards the bottom is the nettle. So this was a bunch of herbs that were kind of boiled and concocted in different ways. And then there was a chant that went with it to use these herbs all together. And then nettle is said to be associated with the god Thor, the god of thunder. I couldn't really find a whole lot on that actually, but I thought this picture was really cool. There are a couple of animals that use nettle. So we have the tortoiseshell butterfly that exclusively uses nettle as a food source and a place to raise their young. So here's their little eggs there. And then we have the red Admiral Butterfly. There's also plenty of birds that eat the seeds, and then there's ladybirds or ladybugs that will use the nettle as well as a place to kind of farm aphids and eat aphids. So there are a variety of animals that use this plant, and I'm actually not familiar with any other animals specifically. Does anybody else know? Nothing comes to mind. All right. So I wanted to talk about the long history of weaving nettles or using nettles for cloth. There's some interesting books out there if you're interested in this. It's kind of something that's been resurging over time. So this one's From Sting to Spin, The History of Nettle Fiber. And I wanted to show you that nettle fiber has been made in lots of different areas of the world and different communities. So this is a website that I definitely recommend that you go look at if you're into textiles or fibers at all. This pre-Columbian textiles and fiber art has a bunch of different pictures of how cordage was made and how fabrics were made. And this website was specific to woodland Indians, woodland Native Americans in our region here. Which I thought was pretty cool. And so this doesn't have nettle in this picture, but they do mention nettle in the text down here. I thought it was really interesting to see the bloodroot there for dyeing. And the process of doing nettles is very similar to using something like milkweed or dog bean. And we do have a native nettle that's found in our region, and I'll show you a slide of that later. Even though it wasn't maybe the same nettle that was in Europe, like I said, there were many nettles that were being used all over the world. Here's another example of kind of how this weaving was done. And then there were many communities that used this as cordage, right? So these were fish hooks from the Macaw community out in Washington State, or what is now Washington State. And so this was a way of using that fiber to then be able to make their livelihood and catch their meals. I thought it was really interesting as I was looking this up just a couple days ago. There was this article in the Seattle Times of this community and how they're fighting coronavirus with self-reliance and their isolation on their tribal lands there. And if you look into what was written in the article, she says, we have preserved our culture and traditional ways enough that we go pick nettles, dig clams, and get mussels. Those are just normal things we do here. So I thought that was really timely and interesting to see in the news. Here's an example of nettle, another type of nettle plant that was created in Japan. And there's a long history of Japanese textile arts coming from this same family of plants that's making this really fine, beautiful fiber. Never fear, nettles is coming back. This is not a historical thing. This picture actually really made me laugh. It just seemed like kind of a silly outfit, but yeah. So there are some fashion designers that are becoming interested in nettles again. And actually there are a lot of crafts folks, folks that are making their own clothing and making their own fibers out of nettles now. So it'll be interesting to kind of see this, this shift and this movement because nettles actually, like I said, has a long history of being used because it is a plant that has long fibers. And so flax is another example, hemp is another example. And when stinging nettle was originally brought to the United States, the Urtica dioica plant was brought to the United States. It was brought, with them not only for kind of medicinal and edible reasons, but very much so because this was a plant that was used in Scotland and in parts of the Northern Europe as a plant to make nets, to make fishing nets, to make linen for household needs. And this was really just only supplanted by flax and hemp later. But a lot of the things that we use now, like cotton, has much shorter fibers, and so you can't get quite as nice of fiber and fabric out of some of the more current techniques that we use, like the carding techniques that we use. This older technique produces very fine fiber that's coarse at first, but over time becomes very soft. Here's another guide out there that you can find. This is Nettlecraft Studios in Scotland. Here's some examples from Nettlecraft of some clothing and some yarn, a selection of items, and then a bowl made from the pulp. And then this is the style that she uses, where she's not doing kind of a traditional style. She's doing the carding style, where it makes shorter fibers, but is a little bit more manageable, she feels like, to use. There's this guy named Allan Brown, who's got some really great resources out there if you're at all interested in learning how to do this. I really recommend his videos. He was recommended to me by Victoria Greba, who's a teacher in Baltimore that teaches drop spindle and plant weaving. So if you're at all interested in the area, I would look up Victoria. So when we harvest nettle for making fiber, just want to walk you through the process really quick because I think it's really interesting. So you are harvesting the stalk. It's the stalk that we're using for fiber to make clothing or to make cloth. But you have to break down the stalk of the plant and red it. And red it is another word for rotting it. So we're leaving it on the grass and we're turning it frequently as a way of rotting it. And then we're going to be able to peel those pieces apart. So there he is starting to peel off that outer bark. And so all he has left there is those fibers. And the more he works it and he uses a knife to kind of scrape along it, the more he gets these really long fibers. And then he'll use a drop spindle to spin them into a finer thread. He's got a Facebook group called Nettles for Textiles. If you're interested, you'll see all kinds of textiles from all over the world of people working with nettles. All right, some uses at home or on the farm. Nettles is a plant that has been used historically and potentially still today as a way to increase egg production in chickens or other fowl. Usually it has to be dried and powdered and kind of added to food for that. Most livestock won't eat fresh nettles, and it can even be hard for them to digest fresh nettles. But if you're willing to go through the process as the caretaker and steward of these animals to dry and to kind of prepare for them, there's many animals that will benefit from having it as part of their food. Horses, there's a history of horses being fed a mixture of oats and nettles as a way to both increase their stamina but also give them a nice shiny coat. And as I was doing a little research and looking through this, I came across a list of studs of horses that were being offered for breeding, and there was a horse that was named Thor Nettle, which I thought was really cool. And then also for increasing milk production. So goats and sheep and cow, again, the nettle has to be dried and added to their food, but that will increase their milk production. And Linda Orz-Rago in Blackberry Cove Herbal, she says that it makes the milk sweeter. There's also a history of using this for cheese making. So rennet is a substance or an enzyme that's taken out of the animal slaughtering process and used for cheese making as a way of curdling the milk and kind of binding things. But nettles, the process I believe is to boil it with some salt and then to use that to curdle the cheese. You can do that as a process of cheese making without having to have the rennet, which is kind of cool. And Cultures for Health has this, this guide for you if you're interested in doing that. There's also the use of nettles for dyeing. This is Rebecca's website here. She has some really great tutorials on dyeing with different herb plants. And nettle makes these different kinds of green, this kind of like nice bluish green. And it's said to be a permanent dye, whereas if you use the root, you could get like a yellowish color, but you would have to use an alum as a mordant to preserve and keep that dye. Not all plant dyes are color fast, like when you wash them, they would go away. But nettle leaf is one that would hold. You can also make paper, and this is a woman on Flickr who had a picture of paper making. We've done some paper making classes at Foxhaven. It's really fun. Carol Henry is an artist in Maryland that works with us to do these paper making classes. We've used all kinds of products to make paper. And then beer. Before the introduction of hops and kind of the move away from herbs into more grains and barley and hops being the dominant for beer, beer was often made from many different herbs. Mugwort was very popular, nettle was popular, nettle, as we just said, yarrow. So these are ways that people would kind of imbibe or take their nettle, was through the process of fermentation. And then somebody already spoke to the composting effect of nettle and how you can use nettle as a fertilizer for your other plants. I'm familiar with it through biodynamic sprays and compost. And does anybody want to explain biodynamic? Anybody very familiar with it out there?
My understanding of biodynamic is imitating, it's kind of like biomimicry, or like using different aspects of nature, like grazing your sheep in your field before you start planting as like a natural kind of fertilizer, not do mechanized processes that you could do otherwise.
Yeah. There's also an association with the moon cycles. I've been following a biodynamic calendar this year for planting at Foxhaven. And so there are days that I plant leafy things, there are days that I plant fruit-bearing things, and there are days that I plant root crops. And that's all based on the moon and kind of the celestial pool of these different times of the moon cycle. And so nettles is a plant that is incorporated into a lot of the biodynamic sprays or into composting. Along with things like yarrow. Comfrey is also usually in there, valerian, and nettle is thought to really be great for increasing fertilization of the soil and the plants that you're giving it to. So we'll do a compost tea at Foxhaven where we'll do comfrey if the leaves are up, and nettle. For us, at least, they usually come up around the same time, so we usually have both at the same time. And we'll do maybe a week or so of putting it into a bucket with a bubbler, and then spraying it on the plants to help with cell proliferation and fertility, especially in areas that we're planting that maybe need a little bit of a fertility boost. The nice thing about planting herbs is that a lot of herbs do really well in poor soils, and that they actually produce more of the compounds that we want, the secondary plant metabolites, when they have some stress. Like if we baby them too much or we give them too much fertilization, they won't need to produce so many of those chemicals. And that those are the constituents that we also use for our health. So it's nice to have the plants be a little bit stressed, but I think it's really lovely to have these biodynamic sprays and composts that feed the whole ecosystem and not just thinking about the one plant. All right, so let's look at some of the medicinal uses. A couple of you have already mentioned a couple of the things that you do, like teas or soups. So I definitely think of nettles as a food as medicine kind of plant, but it's also so much more. And there's different parts of the plant that are used in different ways. And it could be argued that each part of the plant is kind of different medicine. But in general, I feel like it's a plant that is very approachable through the lens of food. And Richo Check, who runs Strictly Medicinals, if you've ever bought seeds from Strictly Medicinals, he also has this book called Making Plant Medicine. And in his book, when I looked up nettles, it says uses, and then he wrote the word legion, which I think is really true. It's a plant that can be used for so many different things, as we'll talk about. So the first being just nutritive, that this is a plant that's really building to the body through both the tissues, the blood, hair, nails, skin, and the bones. So kind of just thinking of this as a plant that fortifies our physical body is usually where I like to start with it. So we'll start with kind of the bones and the muscles. So we've got 1 cup serving. So that's probably 1 cup that's been steamed. Is a huge dose of calcium there, a good amount of magnesium, got vitamin A, and then protein. And then we've got a lot of different essential fatty acids that are found in different parts of the plant, but also in the leaves. What do folks know about things like calcium and magnesium when it comes to kind of muscle and bone health. So I think we often think of, and we've certainly, I think, been advertised to think of calcium as what builds bones, but calcium is only one of the minerals that builds bones. And there is more and more research coming out that magnesium is just as important, if not more important in some ways, for building bone density, especially when we're young. Having higher bone density and higher magnesium helps us to have bone density that lasts into our older age, when we might have more risk for things like osteoporosis. Vitamin A is something I think of when it comes to building and maintaining organ health. And it's helpful in things like creating healthy vision and maintaining healthy vision, right? So like the muscles that control our eyes that can degenerate over time, and then ensuring the normal functioning of our immune system. So vitamin A is critical for that. And then of course, protein is, a body builder and part of one of the building blocks of just body building that we need. So having this all kind of packaged into one, and that's just like a small sampling of the things that are in nettles. And then the essential fatty acids, right? We think of linoleic acid and oleic acid. Those are the ones that we often think of as coming from maybe our fats and our oils, right? Like oleic acid certainly comes from places like olive oil, but to have this also in the form of these leafy greens really is nice, because it means we can add olive oil to it, but we could also just kind of saute it, or put it into a soup without fat. We don't have to actually have the fat in there if we didn't want to. Let's see, it's also high in chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is similar to hemoglobin, and we're going to talk about blood in just a second, but all of the tissues of our body have to be nourished with fresh red blood cells that are bringing through oxygen, and they're bringing through all of the nourishment that we need for all of our tissues. So having strong iron and strong chlorophyll sources for our body to use for energy also helps to nourish all those tissues, and like I said, all the organs that depend on that system. This is from Thomas Easley's book, The Modern Herbal Dispensary, and this is just one of many, many formulas that are out there that use nettle leaf and other things like horsetail and marshmallow, for an herbal tonic. All right, so the blood and the cardiovascular health and how nettles can affect that. So when I think of the cardiovascular health, I'm thinking of maybe individuals who are weakened or depleted, individuals who maybe have had a recent wound, or they've had a lot of blood loss potentially. So that could also be after birth, and we'll talk about how nettles are useful in childbearing. And also folks that are maybe just chronically anemic or have gone through periods of being undernourished or malnourished. So again, those essential fatty acids are really key here. I feel like that's one of the main things that I feel like nettles can bring to the table. And essential fatty acids are useful in regulating blood pressure, the transportation and breakdown of cholesterol, and regulation of blood clotting. If you look through the texts and through the different books about nettles, you'll find that some will say that it's good for low blood pressure, and some will say that it's good for high blood pressure. And it is actually one of those plants that does both. It can help us if we are over or if we are kind of under, and it helps to kind of bring people kind of back to the center. And that's, if you hear the word tonic being used with nettles, that's one of the reasons why, is that it's a plant that's considered generally safe for people to take on a regular basis, even a daily basis. And it's a plant that oftentimes will help us kind of come to more homeostasis. It's not a plant that's generally pushing us in any specific direction. So it's useful for people that are on potentially different ends of the spectrum when it comes to their cardiovascular concerns. Nettles is high in iron, and we talked about iron and hemoglobin, right? And so chlorophyll is really similar to hemoglobin, and iron is also an essential part of how the body functions when it comes to the circulatory system, right? And the main role of iron in the body is that those red blood cells can help carry the oxygen to the body and all the cells and tissues throughout. So there's that binding that happens there with the oxygen. And then there's this, you'll find it in texts a lot, that nettles is thought of as blood building and also blood cleansing. Does anybody have any thoughts about what is meant when we say blood cleansing?
Perhaps I could
Talking about getting rid of toxins in the blood?
Yeah, anybody else have any thoughts?
Angela G says clearing out toxins and extra nutrients.
Yeah. So this this kind of phrasing around blood cleansing comes from kind of an earlier time in at least Western herbal medicine of thinking about the humors of the body and the systems of the body being affected by these different conditions, and that you could have, you know, kind of bad blood, and that often manifested itself in the form of like really low energy, or kind of like skin that was like didn't have shine and luster to it, and kind of like you can see somebody who maybe hasn't been resting well or hasn't been metabolizing well, and they're like, they don't feel well, right? Or they feel undernourished and depleted. And so this was often kind of referred to as bad blood, or, you know, blood that was polluted, you know, kind of talking about toxins like y'all had mentioned. This isn't exactly usually how we think about it today, right? It's not necessarily that the blood has toxins in it, because our body does a pretty good job of regulating that, and the liver and the lymph nodes and all these different systems that we have in the body do a pretty good job of attaching to things that don't belong in the bloodstream and filtering them out pretty quickly. But this is a plant that we would consider an alterative, which means that it's a metabolic tonic, and it's helpful in streamlining the body's system in breaking down and kind of eliminating those wastes. And sometimes those wastes are actually our own cells, right, that are expiring, dying, or they're, our own body's products that are just need to be cleaned out, need to be moved, out of the body. And so an alternative is thought of as a plant ally that's helpful in helping us to bring in nutrition, break it down, and like have our systems be optimized to receive that nutrient, but also identify wastes and transport them out of the body. So it kind of helps the system work smoother around those processes, so that there's not any sort of buildup when it comes to places like the kidneys or the liver, or places of like filtering and elimination. Skin, hair, and nails are also places that we often think about nettles being used. So it's long been used topically and internally to address things like eczema, psoriasis, boils, and acne. I would suggest and like have often seen formulas where you pair it with things like burdock and dandelion and chamomile and calendula, kind of depending on the skin condition. There might be more topical or more internal, right? Something like eczema or psoriasis has a lot of discomfort and pain potentially that's happening on the outside of the skin. So we might be putting poultices or putting lotions right onto the skin, but it's also something that we would probably be taking internally as well. So we'd be taking nettles internally as a way of addressing that outer eczema or that outer psoriasis. And in that sense, I think of its mechanism as working through the liver, because it's often when there's some stagnation or an overtaxing of the liver process that we'll see things like brittle nails or hair, that's breaking, or we're seeing skin that's erupting in different ways, or having kind of these reactions. If we have a liver that isn't overtaxed by, too many things, right? Like maybe we're not getting enough sleep, we have malnutrition, we are experiencing a lot of stress, and like all of those hormonal and chemical reactions, as well as anything we're eating, anything we're being exposed to, anything we're breathing in, all of those have to be filtered through the liver and processed through the liver, broken down in the liver. And so the liver actually has a million jobs, and it does a really good job for all the things it has to do. But there are times when things might get shunted to another place. And the skin is actually an organ of elimination. It's a place where we can, eliminate certain things. And when there is kind of stagnation or overtaxing of the liver, we might see more things get pushed to the skin. And so that is a place where a lot of Western herbalists will start by looking at the liver when there are skin issues. We can also just think about like malnutrition in general. If we're not getting, the B vitamins and the fatty acids and the things that we need to have vibrant skin or vibrant nails, those are things that the nettles might be able to address through all of their nutritional benefits. There are also a lot of folks that will infuse the nettle into vinegar and then dilute that vinegar and use it to treat scalp conditions like dandruff and imbalanced pH. And there are conditions in which having a pH that's imbalanced on the scalp can cause hair loss, and it can cause eczema and these other kind of contact dermatitises. So while we by infusing the nettles into there, we're also kind of bringing some of the soothing qualities of nettles, which I don't think a lot of us think of nettles as being soothing because they have that sting, but historically they have been used to soothe skin also. And the vinegar also is really helpful in bringing a shine and softness and the potential for hair growth through the nettles. Has anybody made infused vinegar for hair rinses before and had success?
I made some with witch hazel and rosemary.
Nice.
I put some essential oils in it though and ruined it, so I didn't get to use it.
It was like too strong.
Yeah, it was way too strong.
Yeah, I'll say that when I first tried this, I didn't dilute the vinegar enough, and I ended up kind of burning my scalp because the vinegar is acidic and kind of harsh actually on your scalp if you don't put enough water in it. So now I dilute it quite a lot. I'll do maybe a tablespoon of the infused vinegar, and then I have like an 8-ounce cup that I'll fill up the rest of the way with water. And after I shampoo, I'll use that as a hair rinse. Yeah, that's a way that I've used it. I also know a woman who has used it as part of like a scalp spray, and she had success with that. She used that with marshmallow and hibiscus, I believe. Here's an example from James Wong. This is his book. I don't know if y'all can see me or if you can only see the screen, but here's his book called Grow Your Own Drugs. James Wong, he's out of the UK. This is a picture from his book on a hair strengthening nettle tonic. All right, the stomach and digestion. So I feel like the stomach isn't actually one that I think of very often for nettles, and it's not one that I see written about a whole lot either, but I feel like it's one that has more of a more of just like a community aspect to it, that like this is knowledge that is passed through communities, maybe more so than through schools and through books. But this is one that I learned about both in Blackberry, Cove, Herbal, as well as a big tome that I have downstairs on the different Native American tribes in the United States who have used all these different plants. And in both of those books, they talked about using the tea of nettle as a stomach tonic. And here again, I'm going to talk about alterative, because this is kind of the way that I thought about using it as a stomach tonic. So this is from Jim McDonald, and he says, nettle is one of the archetypal alterative herbs that nourish our health by strengthening and balancing metabolic functions. It aids the liver in detoxification and treats skin disorders such as eczema, psoriasis, and other rashes, which are believed to result from poor metabolic function. and I don't recall who it was. It might have been Jim McDonald, but someone described alternatives in this way. They said, think of your digestive system or your internal energy body as a wood-fired stove, and you load wood into the wood-fired stove and set it on fire, and you get heat from that, right? So that's your way of producing that energy or that heat that you're looking for. But if you never clean out the chimney, and if you never take out the coals from the bottom, after a while, the oven's just not going to work very well. It's just not going to perform as highly as it should without kind of a cleaning out every so often. And so you can put in the best wood in the world, and you can have dried it and cured it perfectly. But if you're not also working on making sure that the other processes of elimination are working correctly, then the energy that's used for converting that wood that you've given isn't well spent, because it can't kind of fully get to the processes that you're trying to fuel. So that's kind of how I was thinking about it being a stomach tonic, was helping us to bring in nutrients and eliminate not toxins necessarily, but wastes from the system. A lot of people think about nettles for allergic responses. Does anybody have any examples or personal stories that they would be willing to share about using nettles for allergies or asthma or hay fever? Nope. I've met a couple of folks who have been really changed by using nettles. One is actually a woman who's also an herbalist and herb grower, and she told me about how she used to get seasonal allergies every spring that would basically just knock her out. She would have to come home and go to bed. She was just like so congested and so heavy in her head that she couldn't function at work for multiple days in a row. And that this would kind of come and go and last a long time throughout hay fever season for her in the spring. And then when she started to take nettles, things really started to change for her. And she started to notice that if she took nettles early enough, that she was able to totally skip that time in every year where she would have to be basically in bed. So she swears by nettles. And then I've also met a good number of folks at this point now that have asthma, and that use nettles as part of their asthma regimen. And for folks that experience seasonal asthma or seasonal allergies, it's recommended that you start your protocol a couple of months ahead of when you start to get your usual symptoms. So for somebody who maybe gets their symptoms in May, they might start in April or March, start taking nettles on a regular basis, maybe by tincture form multiple times a day, or by freeze-dried capsules multiple times a day. And one of the reasons that we think of nettles for allergic responses when it comes to these different possible ways of having allergic responses like food intolerances or hay fever is that the mast cell in our immune system is a cell that works in tandem with our antibodies and can become unstable and degranulate or denature, and then it releases histamine into that local tissue. So if you look at the screen that I have up right now, in the top left corner, you have the allergens coming in, right? And so let's pretend this is pollen or something, this is skin, but let's pretend it's pollen. And then the Langerhans cells are capturing it and they're taking it to the T cells and the B cells. And the B cell is then creating an antibody. And it's possible, if y'all are listening to the news right now, that you're hearing us, folks talk about COVID and antibodies and whether or not people are producing antibodies. But this is also applicable to when we have allergic responses. So when we've encountered something that the body decides is foreign, right, or is other than us, and it decides that it's going to attack it and neutralize it, it also produces an antibody, which is a memory cell that circulates through our blood and is ready for whenever that allergen is present again. So those antibodies usually ride around on this mast cell, and then when an allergen binds with that antibody that is specifically designed for that, if a couple of those bind on one mast cell, that's when the mast cell will rupture and release histamine, which we all know is something that makes us itch, right? But in our body, histamine is kind of a siren call to bring in more reinforcements for the immune system. So when it comes to something like asthma or allergies, we don't want the immune system coming in anymore, right? We don't want a longer duration of the immune system attacking what's coming in, because maybe it's pollen, or maybe it's something like a bee sting that we actually shouldn't be allergic to, but our body has decided that we are allergic to it, or that it needs to have an allergic response to it. So by taking nettles early and trying to stabilize those mast cells, and then taking it also through an allergic response, we're helping to kind of deprogram or dissuade the immune system from having this all-out, inflammation, itchiness, sneezing, watery eyes, all the things that might come along with an allergic response. When it comes to our immune system, we want this process to happen, but when it comes to something like allergies, then we don't want it to happen. So we want to try to have something that will help us to get through that. So nettles helps to stabilize the mast cells, like we said, and it helps it to stop the release of histamine. There's a couple of different schools of thought of which form of nettles we should use. There's freeze-dried root or leaf. Rosemary Gladstar recommends that. You can have them in capsule form. There's fresh leaf tincture. That's what Guido Masse would recommend. And then Tammy Sweet says that we should be using the flowering leaf tincture if we're using this for asthma. So there's a couple of different schools of thought out there, and I think it's good to kind of just try some different ones and see how it goes. But again, starting early if this is something that you're going to try. It's also just an anti-inflammatory plant. But didn't we already learn that there's histamine in the leaf of the plant? And that's kind of a strange idea that histamine in the plant would help us to control histamine. But there's a little bit of thought and research out there about the histamine that is local, right, that's happening at the local site of the allergen is different from the histamine that's circulating in our plasma, in our blood. So that the thought is that low plasma histamine has been linked to some more severe reactions to inhalant allergens in particular. Antigens is another word for allergen. So it seems that there's a significant difference in the implications of a localized release of histamine as opposed to systemic blood levels. So it's still kind of a mystery as to why nettles is so useful when it comes to things like allergic reactions. But this is one of the thoughts, is maybe that having high plasma histamine helps with the reaction of localized histamine. Kidney health. Kidney health. So we're thinking about nettle when it comes to chronic bladder inflammation or infections, especially when it's combined with something like dandelion leaf to help with flushing. Both dandelion leaf and nettles are both diuretics. So this is something that's going to encourage us to urinate and to kind of move liquids through the bladder. But both of them actually are high in potassium, which is nice because if folks have ever taken a diuretic in pill form, in pharmaceutical form, usually they don't have the ability to have prevent the loss of potassium, which is why they'll also prescribe a potassium supplement to go with it. But in our herb world, they're actually already combined together. So when we think about herbs for the kidneys in particular, I'm usually thinking about seeds. The leaves are great, as a tea for just kind of general health of the bladder and the kidneys. But when we're thinking about kidney disease or kidney failure, then we're talking about the seeds at that point. And there is some concern about harvesting the leaves after the flowers have started to come on. Maybe some folks have heard about this. There's a crystal that is said to form in the leaf that can be irritating to the kidneys. This is something that I've seen kind of on multiple sides of the spectrum, some herbalists saying yes, this is a concern. You should only harvest nettle leaf, in the early spring, and as soon as it starts to flower, then you stop harvesting the leaf for internal use anyways. And then there's other herbalists that say I've harvested the leaf, all through the summer, and I've never seen that be a problem for anybody. but there is some concern about folks that already form kidney stones not consuming nettle from nettles that have been producing flowers already. Something to
Lacey,
think about.
we have a question.
Yeah.
Is there any research on giving nettles to dogs for allergies?
I don't know, but there's an herbalist called, her name was Juliette de Barclay-Levy, and she has written a bunch of books on herbs for animals, and she was a dog raiser of a particular type of dog. I can't remember what kind of, it was a hound of some sort, but I would look into her books if you're interested in using herbs for animals, because she wrote quite a lot about using herbs for animals. So I think there is some information out there. It's just not something that I've looked into much.
Gotcha, thank you.
Fevering. So this is also not one that I usually think of for nettles, but again, in Blackberry Cove Herbal, she talks about how in Appalachian tradition, this was a plant that was used for helping to kind of resolve lingering fevers. And she would do that in the form of nettle seed wine, right? And fevers, flu, bronchitis, pneumonia, whooping cough. This is, she says this is how the grandmothers would recommend a daily dose of a 1/4 teaspoon of dried nettle seed for thyroid problems. And they also said that nettle seeds stir up the lust. Motherhood and transition. So a lot of folks are familiar with using nettles in Nora tea. That's Nora, nettles, oat straw, raspberry leaf, and alfalfa. And that's a combination of herbs that's used for nourishing the expecting mother as well as the baby. And then I think it was Jaya that said that nettles can increase milk production, and that's something that I've been aware of as well, which I thought was pretty cool. It's interesting because I usually think of nettles, at least in my body, nettles as a drying plant. And so it's interesting to me that this is also a plant that seems to give more production in some senses, right? It gives more milk, it gives more eggs and animals, it gives more gloss and shine and sheen to our exterior. But it's also a plant that I definitely think of as being astringent and drying, and a plant that helps to pull away from the body things that no longer are needed. So it's like some interesting parallels there, or different sides of the spectrum. There's a long use of using this plant after childbirth to stop bleeding, or to rebuild blood and energy after birth. This book called Babka's Kitchen Medicines, which is folk remedies of the Ukrainian settlers in Western Canada, has some really interesting stories and pictures and anecdotes about all the different ways that nettles was used. They use it a lot for rheumatism and arthritis, but also very much when it comes to childbearing, both for kind of building the mother beforehand and also for strengthening the mother and rebuilding the blood afterwards.
We have a couple of questions.
Great.
Christine asks, can you please explain how nettles works for the thyroid?
So for the thyroid, yeah. So I think it has to do with the kind of saltiness aspect of nettles, and kind of the I don't want to say, because I haven't really looked into much of the research on that, so I could make an educated guess, but I don't know enough about it to touch on it too much. Does anybody else?
There's also another question. Which form, dried herb, tincture, etc., do you recommend for topical usage for skin issues like psoriasis, eczema, and hives? And how best do you prepare this, mixed with a carrier oil, etc.?
Yeah, I think that for things like the eczema and psoriasis, like I would probably start internally with that. When it comes to, like, I would start with like teas of nettle mixed with burdock probably, and other herbs that are known to be nourishing to the skin, and maybe doing a salve of calendula and chamomile, and then maybe putting some of the nettles in with that. When you're thinking about salves for skin health, especially when it's something like eczema, you want to just think about choosing oils that sit on the skin, maybe that are helpful in creating a barrier for the skin, rather than oils that might disappear quickly, right? Because we're dealing with something that's chronic, it's always there, and so we want something that's going to last a little bit longer. And oils are different depending for different people. Like I really like to use coconut oil. I really love shea butter, but some people find that to be too greasy or it sits too high on their skin. Other people really like to use things like jojoba that sink into the skin really easily. The one thing I'll say about things like eczema and psoriasis is that I would encourage you maybe to consider not using essential oils if you're going to be putting a salve onto your skin, because a lot of essential oils will disrupt the lipid barrier of the skin. And if you already have an issue with your skin barrier, right, you already have eczema, then you don't want to be putting things on the skin that further disrupt the lipid barrier. And things like alcohol will also do that, right? So I probably wouldn't put I wouldn't do like an alcohol spray or any lotions that have alcohol in them, but I would make something that's really like nourishing, like a shea butter or a coconut oil. For me anyways, that's where I would start.
Sounds lovely. Thank you.
All right. Prostate health. This is again, like I was saying, the different parts of the herb have kind of different effects and different things that they work on. This would be the root that we would be using for treating enlarged prostate and for improving the hypertrophy that happens for some men. And David Winston recommends using it with saw palmetto for the synergistic effects that he sees between saw palmetto and the root in particular. I put on here again that Appalachian tradition says that the seeds, stir up lust, and so some folks might, have association with seeds and reproductive health. The roots are also used for sustaining testosterone. And so Rosemary Gladstar here has 2 500 milligram capsules or half a teaspoon of tincture twice daily for 3 to 4 weeks, stopping for a week and then repeating this, cycle for 3 to 6 months. The reason that she recommends stopping for a week is just that if we take something every single day, there's the effect that often will happen in the body just getting really used to that. And then you have to kind of keep upping the dose because the body has become kind of too complacent and too used to it. So by taking a week off or even taking a couple of days off, if you drink the same tea every day, maybe switching it out for another tea every so often helps to kind of keep it new and fresh for the body, because we know that our body has lots of ways of getting used to things and then needing more stimulus to get to that same level again, or that same reaction that we're looking for. All right, and then also pain relief and movement. So this is, you think about old injuries, pain from structural skeletal issues, arthritis, rheumatism. And this is actually using the plant, generally this is using the plant live when it's stinging and stinging yourself intentionally. So hitting yourself with the nettles as a way of stinging that skin and bringing reaction to the skin, really, in movement. That process is called urtication, when you hit yourself with nettles to sting yourself. There's also, some folks that will use it, like Grow Your Own Drugs has this recipe here for using a lotion or a tea for pain relief in arthritis. So this is, drinking the tea for pain relief. But for most folks, when they're thinking about using nettles for arthritis or rheumatism, they're thinking about actually stinging themselves. And what happens is that the formic acid, right, causes the pain and maybe little blisters. Depends on your skin, how you respond to it. But it also brings a fresh blood flow, brings circulation, and it brings movement to an area that maybe has had a lot of stagnation. For some folks with arthritis, they have very limited mobility in some of their joints. And after doing this treatment of hitting themselves with the nettles, they might experience several days without pain and several days of movement that weren't able to be experienced before that. I also, when I'm thinking about old wounds or like a wound that's not healing well, sometimes what is the case is that in the process of that wound healing, especially if it's in a joint or somewhere where we're moving a lot, you know, we continue to kind of break that cycle of healing by moving or, you know, re-damaging it. And so by using the nettles as a way to bring fresh blood flow, we're also encouraging the elimination of wastes, right? So as the tissues are being built there, they're creating waste. There are cells that are dying. There's tissues that, you know, are dying off because they've been damaged and they need to be replaced by new tissue. And so the body has to do that exchange constantly, right? Of bringing in new nutrients and taking away the wastes. And by bringing in a really intense fresh blood flow, you're also encouraging that waste to leave. All right, so how to identify it and harvest it. You can see here that it has opposite leaves and it has a stalk that kind of goes up, you know, pretty straight, and it gets to be, at least for me, like to my, you know, hip or to my waist. So, you know, like a good 3.5, 4 feet, can get pretty tall. And, you know, there'll be stalk and then leaves and then stalk and then leaves. They're not really tightly packed leaves really. And as the plant ages, it'll get more and more spaced out. And then the flowers come out from where those nodes are. And then all over the stem and all over the leaves are these little hairs, those trichomes that have the stinging acids in them. And so you'll be able to see them when you get up close to it. The Latin name is Urtica dioica. And here I've just got a little explanation, right, of what we just talked about, the opposite toothed leaves. Generally, it's going to grow in rich soils. It likes to be in places that are high in nitrogen. So oftentimes, at least in our region, that means that they're growing near water, right? Because in a lot of our regions here in the mid-Atlantic, at least, all the farming and all of the, you know, earth moving that we've done has pushed a lot of our most nutrient-rich soils to the waterways, right? To the rivers and streams that are going to the Chesapeake Bay. And so a lot of times we'll find nettles, you know, near those streams. But they are also a plant that really accumulate nitrogen, right? That's why we use them for compost. So you also might find them just, you know, in old fields where there's, you know, still fertility, or you might find that they, you know, they grow best in places that you might not have expected, like in the middle of the woods, but it's a place that has enough fertility that they are happy there. Urtica dioica, the dye from dioica also kind of leads us to dioecious, which means two houses, which means that there are plants that are female and plants that are male. There are some plants that are monoecious that have, you know, on one plant it has both male and female flowers. This plant has them on separate. So if you're looking to harvest the seeds, you have to find the female plants because they're the ones that have the seeds. Here's the one that I was referencing earlier that is our native nettle. This is Canadian wood nettle, Lapertia canadensis, and it also has stingers on it. The leaves are alternate though, so they're not going to be right across from each other, they're alternate, and you can see that the flowers are a little different, but they are edible and they are also used in food in the same way as our stinging nettle. Here's a little picture of the stinging nettle, and this is not correct because the male and female flowers are on the same plant, but they are just trying to show you that there's a difference in how the male and the female buds look and present themselves. All right, so how to prepare them, gloves or courage? Who out there likes to harvest nettles or touch nettles without any gloves? Anybody feel like that's something that they feel comfortable doing?
Anna says yes.
Nice. Yeah. So if you, they say that if you do it with strong intention in mind, but I think also what's going on is that you just have to be careful. Those little silica caps that are on the end of each hair are really easily brushed off. But for whatever reason, if you use your fingers in a really determined way and hold the plant, you know, carefully, but with a firm grip, you won't get stung most of the time. It's usually, when I hold them that way, what stings me usually is a leaf that will then hit my hand or kind of brush against my hand. But the actual fingers that I'm using won't. And that's also because we have an extra layer of skin on the palm of our hands that we also have at the bottom of our feet. So we have an extra layer of skin there that we don't have on the top of our hand. So if we're being careful and using, that palm of our hand, the palm of our fingers, you can often touch them without being stung. But for some folks, the sting is actually not that bad. I find it to not be pleasant, but I can tolerate it. But a lot of folks find that they just don't want to tolerate it at all. All right, so if you are eating the seeds or using the seeds for medicine, you're going to harvest them in the late fall. For our region, maybe September, October. They can be eaten fresh or dried fresh, or dried. Fresh seeds can be pretty stimulating, by which I mean like kind of jolting to the body with energy. And so kind of starting slow with fresh seeds and working your way up to see kind of like how your body responds to it. And here, Gather Victoria, the blog, she recommends to do them when they're plump and hanging straight down. So you'll see that in the beginning when the flowers start to come up, I'll go back to this one. When the flowers first start to form, they're kind of arcing out a little bit and then kind of going down. And as they get really plump and heavy, they'll be hanging straight down, next to the stalk. That's when you want to harvest the seeds. Here's an example of how to use the seeds. Gather Victoria has these beautiful recipes on her blog. And here's a recipe for nettle seed and dandelion bars. Eating the leaves. So we're generally going to be eating the leaves in the early spring or early summer. If you want to do a stir fry or a steam and use it like you would spinach, you want to use that top growth. Victoria Greba, the teacher in Baltimore that I referenced, she's always teaching people about the meristematic growth. And that's the growth at the top of the plant that's the newest growth. It's vibrant, it's flexible, it's bright green usually, depending on the color of the plant. And that's where both all the nutrients and energy of the plant are, but also where it's the most palatable and tasty. So if you're just kind of looking to saute, then you want to harvest the tops, and it'll keep sending up new tops, which is great. But if you're using it for tea, you can also cut further down and use those lower leaves. They're going to be a little more mature, and they might have a little bit more texture to them, but they're still edible. And then if you're really brave, like our intern Natalie, you can roll the leaf and eat it raw, or place it right on your tongue and let the saliva deaden the needles. And then after it's fully saturated in your saliva, you can chew and it won't sting you. She says that she has been stung in the mouth a couple times though, so you have to be ready for that. This is actually from Natalie. This is her asparagus and nettle soup that she made this week, and she did a nettle butter as well. Nettle pesto, I think Deb said that she made nettle pesto. That's a really common way of using it. There's also things like nettle spanakopita. So in places where you might have used spinach, you could use something like nettles. And then the roots. We're going to harvest the roots in the fall. And the roots aren't really considered food. But again, this is really for, often we're thinking of prostate health and testosterone levels and kind of men's wellness around the roots. I don't actually know of a lot of, or any uses for women necessarily, but does anybody else for roots? Not specific to women anyways, but I've certainly seen tinctures that include the roots and the leaf that are meant for anybody. All right, tastes, energetics, and actions. So this is a plant that's considered salty and sweet. And when we have a plant that is salty to the taste, that's usually an indication to us that there are minerals in that plant. And oftentimes those plants are associated then with the kidneys and with kind of urine and evacuation of urine. Horsetail is another one that falls into that category. Celery also is considered salty and in that same category. And then the sweet is a little harder to taste, especially if you're used to a lot of real sweetness, like it's a very mild sweetness. But when an herb is sweet, like oats is another example of a sweet herb, we tend to think of those in Western herbalism as being nourishing plants, as plants that build the tissues of the body, or kind of rebuild the nervous system or the areas that get depleted in the body easily. And so this is a plant that is both salty and sweet. It's an astringent plant. I already said earlier that I find this to be a drying plant for me. And it is a plant that is considered a diuretic, right? So that it encourages urine evacuation, which means for some people it can be really drying. And so for me, I always put a little bit of violet leaf or a little bit of marshmallow leaf or hibiscus in with my nettle tea, so that for me it doesn't become too drying. I can find that I'll get dry mouth, or I'll just feel kind of dried out inside if I don't have something with it. It's a clarifying herb. That's what we talked about, it being an alternative, right? That it helps to clear out metabolically, stimulating, right? So it's a rubefacient. That's when we were talking about it bringing new circulation and creating activity. It's a nourishing, nutritive tonic. And then it's also a calming plant. It's a plant that we consider an immune modulator, right? In the way that it stabilizes the mast cells and helps us to control overproduction of the immune system. Here's some medicinal preparations. You have a couple options here. This is not all of the options, but here's some that folks will use. Tincture is an extraction into alcohol, and the tincture has the longest shelf life, but it's not good for mineral extractions. So if you're really looking for this to be, you know, a mineral boost for you, like you're looking for it to be nutritive, that like, you know, base bodybuilding, the tincture is actually not really the way to go. But as we saw kind of in the earlier slides, it is maybe the way to go if you're trying to work on a hay fever, although I know people that use nettle tea and find that to be very effective. So there's, you know, some thoughts about whether or not tinctures are the most effective way. If you are going to use a tincture, you know, using a lower strength tincture, so 50% or 75%, rather than like an Everclear, which is very high alcohol, because minerals and vitamins extract better into water than they do into alcohol. A long infusion is another example of something you could try. You can do this with dry nettles or fresh nettles, and you can steep it for 6 to 8 hours. You could do a short steep too, a 10-minute steep if you want, but to really get all that chlorophyll and the, you know, iron and everything out, you really want to do a long steep. So I usually will make it at night, put the cap on it, let it sit on the counter until the morning, and then I'll put it in the fridge and drink it throughout the day. A vinegar extraction we talked about. Vinegar extractions have kind of a short life, but they are a really great extractor for alkaline minerals and for calcium extraction. Oxymel is a vinegar extraction with the addition of honey, right? So if maybe you don't like to take vinegar in, you know, by the spoonful, or you don't like to have vinegar as a cooking, you know, cooking uses, then maybe putting some honey in there and then sweetening it up and adding it to sparkling water might be a way that you might like taking it. And then a succus is when you express the juice of the plant and you mix it with 3 parts alcohol to stabilize it. So this is kind of like a tincture, but you're also, what's nice about this is that you're also getting the minerals from the plant. So this I feel like might be the best way to go if you can do it, is to juice the plant and then stabilize it with alcohol. There's also those freeze-dried pills that you can get. And a lot of people, especially folks that are using it for asthma, really swear by using those. All right, and those were all of my slides. Do folks have questions, or do you have experiences that you want to share? I would love to hear from y'all.
We did get a follow-up question regarding how to use the nettles topically. Which form would work best in your preferred oil, dried herb or tincture?
Oh, to make an oil, a dry herb. Yeah. And it's the Blackberry Cove Herbal. She's the one that talks about nettle topically a good bit, or like touches on it more than most people do. And she had talked about making an infusion of nettle, right? Like a strong tea of nettle. And then what you could do is then wrap, or, you know, soak a linen or some sort of cloth in that, and then wrap that around the affected area. So that doesn't really work if you have, you know, eczema that's widespread, but if you have maybe eczema on your upper arm or something like that, and it's particularly uncomfortable, you could try wrapping it in that way. That was kind of the way that it was talked about in her book, at least.
And to steep, does it matter whether water is hot or cold?
For nettles, I feel like hot water is preferable. There are some plants that really extract better into cold water, like cleavers is one that I can think of, or marshmallow. But for nettles, I would use hot water.
Any other questions? And for some of the book titles and everything, we'll be able to send that out to you all with the recording.
Yeah. So we'll send the recording. I will send you a PDF of these slides if you want to see the slides again. And then I'm happy to write down the book titles that I mentioned tonight. And is anybody interested in the nettle fiber making? I can send some of those YouTube videos of the process of making nettle fiber.
Yes, I know that we did have someone interested in the book that you mentioned. So, oh, Carla says yes, please, for the YouTube videos as well. And Anna and Shelley are also interested.
Cool. Yeah, I'll send those. It's really interesting to watch the video of how he processes them by hand. And yeah. All right.
All right. Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and we really appreciate it. We'll be sending out the recording tomorrow afternoon at the latest, I would say. And yeah, we'll have our contact information if you have any further questions.
It's really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.